Good evening. This is our final day of the week. Tomorrow is Friday, and we'll be doing World War One. World War One. We're going to cover an American aspect of it. So I'm going to pretty much assume that you know the basics. You know who took part in World War One. But let me kind of refresh your memory. There were the Triple Entente, which is a French term, triple, and there was Central Powers. Central Powers. Central Powers were Germany and Austria-Hungary. German Empire and Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the beginning, Italy was allied with Central Powers, but it actually never entered the war. And entered the war later. Didn't enter the war immediately in 1914 when the war started. But it actually entered the war in 1915 on the side of the Triple Entente. Triple Entente were France, United Kingdom, and Russia. The war started over a relatively obscure issue in the Balkans when Austro-Hungarian Empire decided to attack Serbia after the assassination of an heir to the throne to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand. And Russia backed up Serbia, Germany backed up Austro-Hungary, and then France and United Kingdom entered the war. But there is at that time, even as now, there is a lot of confusion and a lot of it's not really clear what was the war about. There are several sort of theories. All of them capture part of the war. President Wilson, who is one of your IDs today, thought that this was a war about democracy. That on the one hand there were the democratic states, France, United Kingdom. Russia actually had a democratic revolution in 1905 and considerably democratized its policy, its constitutional arrangements. And United States, the United States entered the war in 1917. So that's what Woodrow Wilson made it about. A lot of people said, well, this is not exactly true. It is really about the rivalry between Great Britain and Germany, and by extension, the United States. And Germany was growing at an incredible pace in the later part of the 19th century after the unification of Germany in 1871. It was becoming the largest power in Europe, and therefore it was on the move. So a lot of people thought that the war had nothing to do about democracy and things of that sort. Both Germany and Austria-Hungary had a very, very limited democratic rights for their population. Only a couple of percentages of people in both countries, in Germany and in Austria, were allowed the right to vote. So anyways, that's the situation in Europe. The problem with the United States and World War One was that Americans were not really interested in entering the war. So they had to be dragged into it. And President Wilson tried several tricks. What sort of tipped the public opinion about entering the war was the submarine warfare that Germans undertook. The way it worked, British fleet, Royal Navy, and the French fleet, but British for the most part, blocked Germany from the sea and didn't allow anything to come in. Food, supplies, medicine, nothing. This blockade of the German coast in the North Sea was very, very bad for Germany. There were shortages of basic food stuff in Germany throughout the war. So in order to retaliate for it or try to do something about it, Germans could not face the Royal Navy on the sea because the British Navy was much more powerful. So they started the submarine warfare. And basically any ship that was traveling to United Kingdom, to Britain, was a fair game, including American ships or including ships on which there were a lot of Americans. This was the main way of transportation between the United States and Europe. Steamships. Titanic, right? It's something that happened before World War One. So, but there were a lot of these ships that were coming to New York Harbor. And most of them were British, some of them were American, there were some French, there were some German ships, there were some Austrian ships and so on and so forth, coming in and out of New York Harbor. And the famous episode is the sinking of Lusitania, which was a large ship, about the size of Titanic, in 1916. It turned out that there were a lot of Americans on board, and President Wilson made a big deal out of it, that, Germany sank a passenger liner. It turns out later on, more detailed investigation revealed that there were supplies, military supplies on the ship. And the Germans knew about it, but both the British and Americans pretended that they didn't know about it. So anyways, that's one aspect of how the United States was dragged into World War One. The other thing was Mexico. Mexico was in the middle of revolution, and that's why you have Pancho Villa, one of the leaders of the Mexican Revolution that started in 1910 and lasted throughout World War One. Revolution is a messy affair, and there are a lot of factions and a lot of groups. So this was going on the southern border of the United States, and Germany thought about it, using this opportunity to do something in the war. One of the problems with the war was that war was a stalemate. Pretty much from 1914 all the way to the end, the troops dug up on the Western Front, and that was the front on the border between Belgium and France. German troop on the one side, and British and French troop on the other side, and they didn't move very much for the duration of the war. So people are looking for alternative ways how to gain advantage on the world stage. That's why it's called the World War One, right? And Germany offered Mexico, that was help to gain the things, to gain the territories that Mexico lost in 1848, when California, Arizona, and New Mexico were detached from Mexico and made part of the United States. So, Mexicans have not forgotten about it, and they wanted those territories back. And Germans were kind of, eager to help them out. President Wilson kind of made a huge deal about it, and overall, Wilson wanted to get the United States into the war. The problem was that at that time, in 1914, population of the United States was immigrant population. It still is, right? And there were a lot of people of German origin in the United States. You go to Wisconsin, and it's very German. There are a lot of Germans over there, and Scandinavians in Minnesota, and so on and so forth. Not everybody was eager to go into the war and actually fight on the side of the British. So, anyways, be that as it may, the United States entered the war after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. That was a tipping point. There were two revolutions actually in 1917 in Russia. In February, March of 1917, Tsar was forced to abdicate, and Russia had a provisional government up until the new constitution is written, and the state would be set up in a new way, most probably as a republic, right? That was the idea. And then in October, November of 1917, there was a Bolshevik Revolution, in which a fairly radical group of communists. And now, actually, maybe for the first time, you have a distinction between the socialists and the communists, which I kind of hinted in several of these ideas and questions in chapters so far. The main difference between the socialist and the communist is that the socialists want to achieve an equitable society by peaceful means and by democratic means. That's why it's often called democratic socialism. But a communist wants to do it violently. They are in a way similar to anarchists, even though anarchists kind of emphasize individual terror. And communists, or in Russia, Bolsheviks, in Russian, right? They advocated the violent overthrow of the government and the dictatorship of the proletariat, which meant the dictatorship of the Communist Party. And that's what happened in Russia, that's what happened later on in China, and so on and so forth. Every communist country followed the same pattern of dictatorship of the proletariat, which meant really the rule by a single party, Communist Party. Now, this issue presented, when it happened in 1917, presented a lot of problem to the Allies, both here in the United States and in France and in the United Kingdom. There were a lot of left-wing labor activists who thought that this war is about imperialist rivalry. It was not about democracy. It was nothing about some lofty ideals. Make the world safe for democracy, as President Wilson said. But they thought it was about the imperial rivalry between England and Germany. So they thought, why should we take part in it? So therefore you have Samuel Gompers of AFL, American Federation of Labor, and it says Samuel Gompers and World War I. So, and you have Eugene V. Debs, IWW, Wobblies, International Workers of the World, and World War I. You have a split in the trade union and labor and socialist groups. Samuel Gompers represents the AFL, a mainline trade union that exists, that that exists also at the Union County College. We professors are members of it. And Samuel Gompers worked with Woodrow Wilson to prevent strikes, to prevent any sort of political action during the war, because war is a tricky thing. People get suspicious very, very quickly and overreact, and that's what really happened. Eugene Debs was a socialist, and he was much more radical in his opposition to the war, and that presented a big problem for President Wilson, who was conducting the war, so that Eugene Debs actually ended in prison. And it was only freed by the Republican president, who sort of freed Eugene Debs just to spite Wilson. But that's, anyways, that's a minor story. Yeah. So, anyways, another idea, you have Wayne Wheeler. Wayne Wheeler is the founder of the temperance movement. If there is a person who is responsible for the temperance movement are those who want to prohibit the manufacturing and drinking, consumption of alcohol. So that's your prohibition person. And finally have Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a fascinating president. A lot of people love to hate him, in particular because she was not kind to the labor activists like Eugene Debs and others. The first Red Scare happened under Wilson. And that's Red Scare is the persecution of communist sympathizers. And there is a lot of mythology with this, associated with this idea of Red Scare. Another one is going to happen after World War II, so that's coming up in the second week of our course. But here, nobody's innocent here. That's what I would point out. Because, communist activists and labor activists want to present it. Oh, we were completely innocent. We just, we're exercising our civil rights, and then Wilson just took us to jail and so on and so forth, which is not true. I mean, there were revolutions left and right. There was a Bolshevik revolution in Russia towards the end of the war, and there was a Bolshevik communist revolution in Germany. That's how the war ended. In Germany, there was internal rebellion. In Germany, there was a communist revolution in Hungary. There was a Bolshevik revolution in Hungary, which is part of, Austria-Hungary. So, communism was the thing of the day at the time. It was a popular thing to do. It was fashionable. In the 19-teens and 1920s, it was cool, as you guys say, to be a communist in the 1920s. So, anyways. And, those people are dangerous, especially during the war. So, you understand Woodrow Wilson. On the other hand, Woodrow Wilson was a hard-nosed person. And with an ego that was bigger than, I don't know what, Mount Everest or, something very big. For example, Woodrow Wilson was a president of Princeton University and a Presbyterian. Originally, Princeton was a Presbyterian college. And he, when America was entering the war in April of 1917, he made a list of 14 points about, under these conditions, America will enter the war. And therefore, after the war, there'll be a settlement. And there were all sorts of things like, League of Nations, world peace, the self-determinations of nations, that all the nations in Europe and the world will have right to self-determination. It was just a declaration of a wish list about, you know, what Woodrow Wilson thought the world would look like. So French are kind of found found the way how to they had to deal with it, because, you know, Woodrow Wilson at the end of the war came to Paris, where the peace conference was held in Paris, and he was greeted as a messiah. He was the person who was going to bring the world peace. And World War One was horrible. Their casualties in that war were horrible. About 1 million people from the United Kingdom, young men, died. 1.4, 1.5 million young people in France died on the front. So that's a lot of casualties. Some people actually calculated that the amount of casualty that was happening on the Western Front, which interestingly enough never moved, it was just moving a couple of miles, you know, up and down, but there were a lot of dead people there. You know, people were dug up in the trenches. They were ordered to charge against the enemy. They would jump out of the trenches and they would be cut off with machine guns, enemy machine guns. And that repeated itself again. So people said that, you know, it is as if somebody was just shooting 20,000 people every day for the duration of the war for 4 years. That's how many casualties there was. So it was a huge shock, and people had a lot of goodwill towards Wilson. Except for the French Prime Minister, who said, well, when he read the 14 points, he said, oh, wow, good Lord. Well, that's what he said. Bon Dieu, that's the French expression. The good Lord was satisfied with 10 commandments, and Wilson will have us have 14. So, anyways, but you know, those are the beginnings of a modern international system like United Nations. The ideas of United Nations were actually implemented first by Wilson during this organization that was called League of Nations. So that was it. Let's see, what do we have else here? Eugene Debs, interesting character. Questions: Central Power, Revolution in Mexico, Total War, Lusitania, what was it? Zimmermann Telegraph. All right. Selective Service Act. The draft was introduced. One of the, actually, yeah, this is something that I want to tell you also. One of the things that happened during the war was that America became a superpower after World War One. Before, it was a big state, but a military dwarf. U.S. military was disbanded after Civil War. So there were countries in Europe, smaller countries, like one of the Serbia, like it was that's where World War One started. Had a much larger. It was a country of 4 million people. Had much larger military than United States. And so then United States got into it in 1917, and a lot of people were recruited through this, you know, Selective Service Act, drafted, and sent over to France. They were decisive for the victory, but also America profited from the war in another way, because for 3 years, from 1914 to 1917, America was outside of the war, but it was supporting the Allies, French and the British, and it was financing the Allies. So New York, as the banking center of the world, originates from World War One. That's when it happened that, you know, banks of New York extended credit to British and French governments to buy supplies for the war. And this was the mechanism by which the United States became a dominant power in the world after World War One. Anyways, what else do we have? League of Nations. League of Nations. This idealism of Woodrow Wilson was not well received in the United States. His life work was this treaty at Versailles that was supposed to be a peace treaty to end World War One, and was also, as he said it, a peace treaty that would end all wars. So he was quite ambitious about it. Republicans in the Senate just blocked it and didn't want to adopt it. They didn't want to vote for it. So America, actually the United States, never really ratified the Treaty of Versailles that Woodrow Wilson was so eager about. Okay, you have some of the here bombing of the Wall Street and so forth in front, killing 40 people, and so those are the things that were happening. As I said, there were World War One throughout the 4 years was just rife with rebellions. You have a situation that hundreds of thousands of people are sent to the front. They were told to go into the trenches and then told to jump out of the trenches, climb over the top, and start running towards the Germans, hoping that they will break the lines and then they will be killed. So when people face death, they have not much to lose. And therefore there were rebellions left and right in the French army, in the UK or Army of United Kingdom, among the Americans, even though Americans sort of were latecomers, so that they were relatively fresh troops and they were not, jaded, so to speak. So, anyways, that was the opposition to the war was really intense everywhere, and in Russia it exploded. It exploded. It resulted in a revolution, 1st of February, March of 1917, and then the communist takeover in November, October. Anyways, 19th Amendment, Calvin Coolidge, after Wilson, who run with the slogan, "Keep cool with Coolidge." One of the more fascinating presidents, very interesting character. So anyways, right. I think that's about it. A little bit about flappers. I'll give you some examples of the flappers so you can look at this in question 19. So look at these names, Zelda Fitzgerald and so forth. Betty Boop, Coco Chanel, and so on and so forth. So try to figure out what these flappers were about. It might help you with your essay, which is coming up on Monday. All right. And finally, we have two interesting things that. As men were sent to war, somebody had to work in the factories that made ammunition, artillery shells, all sorts of supplies for the army. And this was done either by women, or a lot of people actually moved from the south, the so-called Blues Highway. Black people in particular, they just went to the cities of the north, Chicago, Detroit, the factories in Detroit, which started, which were in the outside of the war. They were car factories, automobile manufacturing, but during the war they started making war equipment. and those were the factories that won American wars, and they were filled with people who came from the South. In particular, also here in New York, a lot of African Americans came to New York and sort of traditionally settled in Harlem. If you don't know where Harlem is, you should Google it, and you should, remember where Harlem is. So I think that's all that I have for you guys this evening. I'm a little bit on the slow side because still recovering for this flu or whatever this thing is, but feeling a little better. So see you guys tomorrow morning, or actually high noon, right? High noon. All right. Have a great day. Bye.